So Jan, he just won a bone cruncher against Ding Loren, game 2, black pieces, and it's inspired me to take a look back at this game. So these were the opening moves of the third game of the World Championship match between Vladimir Kramnik and Vishy Anand 2008. And here on move 4, this is where Vlad played pawn to h3. No, I'm joking, he didn't play pawn to h3. But the reason this game reminds me of the one played today, and Vishy talked about this himself, by the way, in the commentary studio with Irina Krush, is because with the black pieces, Vishy just gets this huge attack. You're going to see the themes, right? So let's take a look at this one. We see knight c3. Now this is the Slav defense with the pawn on c6. But now this pawn comes to e6 and it's the semi-Slav defense. And Vishy playing this over the years inspired me to take this one up, especially a game I'm going to reference in a moment, but hold that thought. So e3 now played. Now if white goes bishop g5, this is where you can get the craziness of the Botvinnik variation, super sharp. But okay, e3 is actually the more mainline move, and now knight b to d7. So black just holds off with developing the king side here, gets that knight out, and the bishop I've highlighted, the queen's bishop, looks horrendous. It's covered in by this knight, also the pawns here on light squares. What's the idea? Well, after bishop d3 from white, here we start to see it. So pawn takes on c4, bishop recaptures, and b5. This is the idea to get this bishop out. Now we see bishop d3, bishop e2 also playable. Lots of theory from here, as you can imagine. And now here black has a choice. So in this game we see pawn a6, bishop b7, also a very mainline move. And bishop d6 is the move that Vishy played in his immortal game against Levon Aronian 2013 Tata Steel. That inspired me to take this whole system up. So check that one out if you never have done so. So in this game, a6 on the board. And now e4 is very principled, taking the center. White can castle there immediately, a bit slower, and now black has to be careful, because say you play a normal developing move like bishop to e7, well now e5 comes, and this is a really bad pawn structure, because look at the light squared bishop, you're in a kind of horrible French pawn structure position, white's having fun, about to attack you. So coming back here, we don't see, bishop e7, we see c5. This is the principled way to play. And now there's two main theoretical moves for white. One is d5, a temporary pawn sack, with the idea of then going e5, exposing the king in the center. The other way to play, as Vlad does in this game, is with pawn e5. Now, again, if that knight moves, we can chop, we've got a good pawn structure. So the main move is pawn takes on d4, counter-attacking this knight. And now the best way for white to play, as Vlad does, is to take this pawn on b5. What's the idea? Well, you move the knight away from the attack, and you win a pawn, and this one's still under fire. Now we do see these knights swapping off. If black tries to save the knight with knight d5, well then white takes here, and with a good game, centralized minor pieces, nice space cramp with this pawn, castles is coming quickly, no problems. And white is a pawn ahead as well, let's not forget. So coming back here, we instead see the knight captured. Now we see takes here, and the whole point of this variation, we see the g-pawn recapturing. Is this starting to possibly remind you now of the Nepo game, which we saw earlier today against Ding Loren? So you open the g-file, you double these pawns, but you get really dynamic play. So castles from white, going back one move. Why aren't these pawns captured yet? Well, if you take here, we have check and you win the bishop, no good. And if you take this one, well now there's queen b6, and it kind of comes with tempo, because you're hitting the knight, it backpedals, then there's bishop b4 check. These ones can come off, and rook g8, and there's this big attack coming now. For example, if you castle, well you're walking straight into this bishop b7 stuff, really aggressive play for black, just not a good order to do things in. So coming back here, we instead see castles played first. Now queen b6, so white can't quite recoup the pawns yet, but after queen e2 threatening to win back b5, well, Vishy doesn't even try and hang on to it. You know, if you play a move like bishop a6, well, it's a bit passive, you're waiting for white to do something. Why not go bishop b7 and immediately hit this long diagonal? And that's indeed what Vishy does. So the pawn drops. Now we see bishop d6. Look at those bishops. I love those bishops just staring at the king. Rook d1 eyes that pawn in the center, and now rook g8 inadvertently defends it, because if you take with the knight, for example, well, then we're crashing through here, of course. No good. So g3 played to blunt that rook. Now we see rook g4, such a tricky move. So this does directly defend the d4 pawn along with the queen, so there's no capture, and it sets a trap. If you go pawn h3 to kick that rook, well, then there's this sneaky move of d3, attacking the queen, opening up this queen to eyeball this pawn and king, and therefore pinning this one. And so say the bishop captures this pawn, well, now we crash through with check, and after the king goes, you know, you're losing a piece, you're losing something here. It's obviously just absolutely horrendous, no good. So you don't want to go pushing this pawn, weaken the g3 square. Instead, Vlad, he goes for this very, very tricky and tactical defense with bishop f4. The top move, by the way, of the modern engine, remember this is 2008, is pawn to b4, with the idea being you sack a pawn, but you look to go bishop b2 and bring the bishop out like that, and it gives white a decent advantage. But okay, sticking with the game, Vlad goes bishop f4. Now, what is the idea of this? Because aren't you just literally losing a piece? You know, you can't recapture, the pawn is pinned. Well, here's the really tricky idea from Vlad. He plays knight takes on d4, opening up his queen to attack that rook. We see Vishy defend the rook with pawn to h5, and now knight takes on e6 played, just trying to rip open the king and punish black for never castling. So the pawn recaptures, that's forced. You know, there's all sorts of discovered checks here, it's terrible. Oh, and if you go with the queen, well, then we're running into this bishop takes d7 check, and you win the queen. So pawn captures played. And now this is the idea. You win back one of those pieces. You know, when the knight moved, it opened the rook. Okay, very nice. And now because of this pin and the pressure, the king has to sidestep, and then queen d3 is the idea. This is Vlad's follow-up move. And if we just take stock, so I'm drawing the threat on the board, which is queen h7 and then delivering mate. But also, although Vlad is still a piece down, he's got two pawns for it and this huge attack. Now, how do you stop that invasion from the queen? Well, rook g7 is the best move. Vishy finds it. We see rook captures, king captures, and now Vlad, he regains his piece. So he's 2 pawns ahead. But the problem is this king, very exposed. Now the computer gives this position as zeros, but very tactical, of course. And now this is an interesting moment. So rook d8 is played. Now what's the point of that? Well, after queen e2, which Vlad plays, eyeing this pawn, only now does Vishy go king to h6, not just covering the pawn, but now opening the g-file. And the reason I mention all of this stuff is you could have started with king to h6, not played rook d8 first, you know, then just done this in one. But it's interesting that now after king f1 played, anticipating rook g8 on the board, a4, well, now when bishop g2 check comes, well, there's no square on e2 for the king. And when I was kind of clicking around the difference between the variations, well, sometimes the king wants to sit there, and so this queen's actually in the way. So earlier on, coming back here, the queen actually should go to b3 is what the engine was saying. Really interesting stuff from Vishy. So king e1 played. What's the difference? Well, now bishop h3 comes, and this is way more of a threat because the king's not here. You know, there's a threat to check, skewer, win the rook. So Vlad goes rook a3, brings it up here. Computer preferring rook d1, but a tough move to play, you know, coming onto these light squares. Now, why does Vlad do this? Well, he's preparing to support a move like pawn f3 once the bishop comes here. And that's what we see after rook g1 check, king d2, queen d4 check, king c2, now this bishop comes to g4. Bishop f5 check, also possible. This is not fun for white, despite having the extra material, because after f3, which was played in the game, this king is getting hunted. We see bishop f5 check, and now this is just a straight up blunder from Vlad. He actually had to play this rook d3 move, which looks horrible to be giving back this exchange if black wants it. But after bishop d3, well, this is the problem. You can take with check, and however recaptures, you're getting mated. So if the queen goes, this is the simplest. Check, king c1, and the queen comes here, and this is mate. Coming back here, if instead the rook captures, well, then we've got this check. If the rook blocks, you lose your queen, leading to mate soon. And if the rook doesn't block, so say you go king d2, well, now there's this checkmate down on c1. You know, the king's boxed in. Crazy stuff. So actually, Vishy had a win here on the spot with bishop takes on d3. But he plays bishop h3, preparing rook g2 to win the queen. And actually, Vlad just cannot stop that threat. There's too many problems. So he starts running his a-pawn. Rook g2, a6, captures with check, bishop recaptures. But after bishop f5 check, there's just no respite for this king. We see king b3 played. If instead the bishop blocks, trying to hold on to that piece, the problem is you can actually win it by force. This is one sample line. Check, king c3, and queen takes here. Now again, you're threatening to win the piece. Well, what if king d2, opening up the rook's defense? Well, now we can go here with check. The king goes, the queen checks again, king c2, and now queen e2 check is just another sample line of how you win this piece. You know, there's this horrible pin, you can't take the queen, that's about to drop. Then this pawn gets recouped, or with bishop here to stop it, it's all over basically. So instead of going bishop d3, we have king b3 on the board, queen e3 check, king a2, the bishop drops, and a7 looks really scary, but here's the problem. Queen c4 check, king a1, queen checks, king a2, and bishop b1 check, forced resignation from Vladimir Kramnik. Why? Well, if you step back to the corner, this is a very thematic checkmate, and if instead of stepping back, you come up to b3, well, now we can check, force the king up the board, win another pawn with check, king b5, and the simple bishop e4 just ends the game. Because even if white makes this queen, well, you can just capture, rook takes back, and this is a lost endgame, queen against rook, plus the extra pawn won't take long at this level. So I hope you enjoyed this fantastic game from Vishy. To see another exceptional game, check out the video on screen. Thanks very much for watching, and see you soon.